This is Macroevolution PowerPoint set 2, talking about allopatric speciation. So when we talk about speciation, or the idea of species dividing, these metallogs look very similar, yet they are not the same species. And we want to talk about how did we end up at that point. Whereas like these sea star species look very different, but they are all the same species. What's important first when we start to talk about actual speciation is that a species is a group of interbreeding organisms that produce viable, aka offspring that can have more offspring, fertile offspring in nature. Members of a species will interbreed with one another, but not other organisms outside of that species, at least most of the time. And we'll talk about in certain cases where interbreeding between species might occur. We start to really get heavily into macroevolution at this point. Macroevolution is on a scale of separated gene pools, whereas microevolution, we're looking at a gene pool of a specific species. When we talk about evolution, the first kind of species that we need to talk about is asexual species. Although they don't exchange genes, they do form a recognizable group, right? Because if I'm reproducing asexually, I'm not combining my genetics with a new or another individual. Most have evolved from asexual species and are capable of asexual reproduction out of necessity. Only those whose phenotype is best adapted to the environment will survive, but it does make them less adapted to environmental change. For example, dandelions are asexual, the pollen is sterile, and the eggs are diploid, which means they just have to deposit eggs and they will create more of the dandelions. A ring species is a connected series of neighboring populations, each of which can interbreed with close, if they are just proximally close. This is what I'm talking about, what I'm getting at. Technically, species will not reproduce with each other, but if they are very similar and they are right next to each other, they may reproduce. Eventually, as they become less proximally close, or like location-wise close, they may start to deviate into more specific species, but they will interbreed. The most common, and this is an image of that, but the most common interspecies or ring species we talk about is humans. If we recall, in human evolution, there were actually 3 types of humans, or 3 species of humans existing all at the same time. They were definitely 3 separate species, although if they came across each other, they would either kill each other or they would mate with each other. This is why eventually we see the extinction of the other 2 forms of human species, although some of their genetics are still present in our own genetics. And so what we know is that sometimes mating between species is very possible, and when they get close enough location-wise, they will reproduce, but technically they are separate species. Another ring species we see are these salamanders in California. Along the areas where these colors touch, they will interbreed a little bit, but technically they are all subspecies or different species. They can interbreed. And this again shows the blue area is where interbreeding occurs, but technically they remain, they don't by choice search out individuals of the other species to mate with. And so this kind of looks at this idea again that there's basically 2 ends to the ring. It's not actually a true ring, that there's 2 ends of the spectrum that will not mate with each other, and then all of the species in between will mate with each other if they become location-wise very close, but they usually opt to mate within their own species. This increases genetic variability, though, in all of the salamander species, which is beneficial because we know genetic diversity is very beneficial. When we see limited interbreeding, we think of the example of the dogs. Each canis species will interbreed with the domestic dog, but not readily with one another. This is true even when given the opportunity to do so, thus they are not the same species since they do not interbreed in nature. So this is another example of not a ring species at this point, but limited interbreeding, right? Certain species will choose to interbreed with a very, very similar species and then choose not to breed with certain other species. Tigers and lions will interbreed in captivity, but they do not interbreed in nature. So again, separate species, but they will technically breed with each other. And this has a lot to do with separation of location as well as like behavior patterns. We see that not only is it just based on location, but they physically are not around at the same time and not in the same type of groupings to interbreed. We've kind of looked at cladogenesis and anagenesis. Please go back if you need to review that content. But now we need to get more specific about speciation. If we look at allopatric or sympatric speciation, allopatric speciation, or the development of new species, occurs because a given group has been separated from the parent group because of geographic separation as time goes by. That's allopatric. Sympatric speciation occurs when they are still living in the same area and there's another environmental factor that causes speciation to occur. For allopatric speciation, the first thing we see is geographic isolation occurs. This is a isolating mechanism that is brought about by the environment, some sort of geographic barrier. Once the two populations become isolated from each other, we see like a change in the gene pools. When they become sympatric again, or when they resume being in the same area again, two different things might happen. They may have become separate species and they can no longer interbreed, or they can still interbreed and they remain the same species. Usually the second occurs if they have not been separated for very long, or if when they were separated they still resided in very similar areas. The most common type of allopatric speciation is when we see species moving from one island to the next and becoming totally separate. Why does speciation occur after geographic isolation? Typically, the population that's left will have a different allelic makeup than the new group. We call this the founder effect. The two groups will continue to experience different mutations potentially, different environmental pressures. The two groups will now experience genetic drift and different selective pressures due to living in separate environments, and therefore we see speciation occurring. We also call this adaptive radiation. The idea that as different groups of a certain species move to different areas, they're going to adapt to the environment and eventually become a different species. The most common example of this is in the Galapagos Islands. There are now 14 different species of finches and 13 main islands, 3 smaller islands, and 107 rocks and islets. So essentially we see that started out as one finch species, became quite a few based on location. This is a cladogram of that, or a phylogenetic tree, I should say. One would expect that each island would have only one species. However, each island has more than one species finch, and larger islands have as many as 10. The process of one species inhabiting a new area, evolving into several new species, is called adaptive radiation. So not only did the original group move to the new island, differences in need for food, protection, and being in different niches in the environment created the speciation of multiple organisms or multiple new species on a certain island. Again, this is an example of that. Feel free to review this on your own. If you want me to cover this in class, I'm happy to. Adaptive radiation. Feel free to pause and read through these. I won't go over all of these.